Dust and Thunder, A Tale of the Old West. The sun hung like a tarnished penny in the Texas sky, casting long shadows across the drought-cracked earth of the Double R Ranch. Hank Reeves sat astride his dun mare, watching dust devils dance across the parched landscape like lost spirits searching for salvation. His weathered face, carved by 40 years of wind and worry, told a story older than the rusty spurs jangling at his boots. "Reckon it's time, old girl," he murmured to his horse, patting her sun-warmed neck. The mare's ears twitched in response, familiar with her master's touch after 15 years of partnership. They'd seen more than their share of trouble together, survived more than their share of storms. The ranch house ahead stood silent as a gravestone, its peeling paint and sagging porch a testament to harder times. Sarah would have hated to see it like this. His wife had always kept the place spick and span, bright as a new silver dollar. But she'd been gone 3 years now, taken by the fever that swept through these parts like wildfire in dry grass. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Hank's attention to the horizon. A rider appeared, silhouetted against the setting sun like something out of a fever dream. As the figure drew closer, Hank's hand instinctively moved to rest on the worn pearl handle of his Colt. Old habits died harder than outlaws in these parts. "Evening, Mr. Reeves," called out a familiar voice. Young Tommy Wheeler, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, pulled his sorrel gelding to a stop. "Got word from town. The Hamilton boys are stirring up trouble again." Hank spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. The Hamilton boys were about as welcome as rattlers in a bedroll. They'd been trying to muscle in on honest ranchers' water rights ever since the drought began, figuring might made right in times like these. "What kind of trouble we talking about, boy?" "They're holding old Mac Peterson's place. Say they won't leave till he signs over his water rights." Tommy's voice cracked with anger. "Got his daughter Emma there too." A cold wind whistled through the mesquite, carrying the promise of violence. Emma Peterson had been Sarah's goddaughter, taught her letters right there on that sagging porch. Some things a man couldn't abide, drought or no drought. "Fetch Jake and Bill from the north pasture," Hank said, checking his gun belt. "Tell Em to meet me at the crossroads." "And Tommy?" The young man turned in his saddle. "Make sure they bring plenty of cartridges. Might be wearin' for a long night." As Tommy galloped off, Hank led his mare back to the barn. In the dim light, he pulled his old Winchester 73 from its oilcloth wrapping. The rifle had been with him since his days riding with the Texas Rangers, back when he was young and full of fire, before he'd learned that justice and the law weren't always the same thing. An hour later, four riders moved through the gathering darkness like shadows made flesh. The moon hung low and heavy, painting the landscape in shades of silver and black. Ahead, the Peterson place squatted against the horizon, yellow lamplight spilling from its windows. "3 horses out front," Jake whispered, his voice barely louder than the night wind. "Probably got one man watching the back door." Hank nodded. The Hamilton boys weren't known for their smarts, but even they wouldn't leave their backs unguarded. "Bill, you and Tommy circle around behind. Jake and I'll take the front. Wait for my signal." The air was thick with tension as Hank and Jake dismounted, moving forward with the careful precision of men who'd done this dance before. The porch steps creaked under their boots, loud as thunder in the quiet night. "Evening, boys," Hank called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of hard choices and harder consequences. "Might be you're lost. This here's Peterson land." "Well, if it ain't Hank Reeves," came a drawling voice from inside. "Ain't your fight, old man? Best ride on home while you still can. See, that's where you're wrong, Luke Hamilton. Made it my fight when you brought Emma into it." Hank's spurs clinked softly as he moved closer to the door. "Way I see it, you got 2 choices. Walk out now, guns on the ground, or leave feet first. Don't much care which." Laughter echoed from inside, sharp as breaking glass. Awful big talk from a broken-down cowpoke. "Times changed, old man. Ain't no place for your kind no more." "Maybe so," Hank agreed, his voice calm as still water. "But some things don't change. Right and wrong, for instance. Honor. The fact that a man's word ought to mean something. The silence that followed stretched tight as fiddle strings. Then came the sound of a hammer being cocked. What happened next moved faster than thought. The front door exploded outward as Luke Hamilton burst through, gun blazing. Hank dropped and rolled, his own Colt roaring in response. Jake's Winchester spoke twice from the shadows. From the back of the house came more gunfire, sharp and urgent. When the smoke cleared, Luke Hamilton lay face down in the dust, his gun still clutched in his lifeless hand. His brothers hadn't fared much better, one dead, one wounded and trussed up like a calf at branding time. Emma Peterson ran from the house into Tommy Wheeler's arms, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face. Her father followed more slowly, looking older than his years. "Don't know how to thank you, Hank," Mac Peterson said, his voice rough with emotion. "Anything you need, anything at all." Hank holstered his gun, feeling every one of his years. "Just be sure that water rights paper gets filed proper at the county seat. And maybe see to fixing that loose board on your porch. Sarah always did hate the way it squeaked." Later that night, Hank sat on his own porch, watching the stars wheel overhead like distant campfires. His mare dozed in the yard, occasionally stamping a hoof or swishing her tail. The Winchester lay across his lap, clean and oiled, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. He thought about what Luke Hamilton had said about times changing. Maybe they were. Maybe the West wasn't as wild as it used to be, the spaces between towns growing smaller every year. But some things stayed the same, the way the wind sounded through the mesquite at night, the smell of sage after rain, the knowledge that a man's word and his actions were all he really had in the end. Sarah would have understood. She'd always said that fame was like fool's gold, bright and shiny, but worth nothing when real trouble came calling. Love, now that was different. Love was like water in the desert, precious and rare, worth fighting for, worth dying for if need be. Pain and shame? Well, those were just the prices a man paid for living true to himself. A coyote called from somewhere in the darkness, its lonely song echoing across the empty spaces. Hank smiled, feeling the weight of his years and his choices settle around him like a familiar blanket. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, maybe rain, maybe trouble, maybe both. But for now, the night was cool, the stars were bright, and he was content knowing he'd done what needed doing. As he dozed off in his chair, the ghost of Sarah's voice seemed to whisper on the wind, "That's my cowboy. True as steel and steady as the North Star." And in the end, that was all any man could hope to be. If you are enjoying the content on the Western Echoes, Cowboy Tales Unleashed channel, hit the subscribe button for future post.